The Quiet Night, the Bob Lee Story. Part 1. A Quiet City, a Restless Mind. Tonight, I invite you to settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath slow, long and gentle. And as the world quiets around you, we will walk, softly, carefully, into the calm retelling of a story that caught the attention of millions. It is a story not of gore or fear, but of mystery, friendship, choices, and the gentle unraveling of a life lived in the bright, glowing world of technology. This is the story of Bob Lee, a man whose name rested behind apps millions of people used every day, and whose final night raised questions still lingering like fog over a San Francisco dawn. Before we step into that night, let us begin someplace quieter. A memory of who Bob was before the headlines. A mind always building. Bob Lee was the kind of man whose thoughts seemed to glow. Those who knew him often described him as restless, but not in a tired way. In a curious way, as though his ideas ran a little faster than the world could quite keep up with. He was brilliant in the ways that matter most in Silicon Valley. Quick, visionary, endlessly creative. But he was also warm. A good friend, a devoted father. A man who loved to create not for attention, but because creation was joy. He had helped build a tool almost everyone knew. Cash App, a simple green square on millions of phone screens. But behind it, years of thought, ambition, planning, and collaboration. And for Bob, that app wasn't just a product. It was a piece of himself, a dream made real. Yet in the months leading up to that night, his life had shifted. He had moved to Miami, to be closer to his father and to find a new rhythm. Still, the magnetic pull of tech gatherings, friendships, and opportunities beckoned him back to San Francisco, even if only for brief visits. And so on a calm evening in April 2023, Bob returned to a city that held both memories and mysteries, a city with its own quiet pulse. San Francisco at night has a very particular energy. The fog moves like a curtain, the lights shimmer softly behind it, and the streets, especially on weeknights, carry a strange mixture of calm and unpredictability. On April 3rd, Bob spent time with friends, talking, laughing, catching up on what felt like the familiar hum of tech life. Nothing about the evening felt alarming or heavy. The night held no warnings, no shadows that whispered danger. Instead, it held simple moments, the kind that seem so ordinary we barely notice them. A shared meal, a casual conversation, an Uber ride, a message sent, another replied. Just the comfortable rhythm of a man moving through a city he thought he understood. When he left his friends that night, he walked into streets that were quiet, dimly lit, soft around the edges like a watercolor painting left in the rain. There was nothing to suggest the hours ahead would become the center of a nationwide conversation. And that is part of why the story remains haunting, because sometimes life shifts suddenly, with no warning at all, an unexpected detour. As the night deepened, Bob moved through neighborhoods known to many, areas filled with luxury apartments, glass windows, and quiet sidewalks. It was well after midnight. But Bob was comfortable being out late. He had done it many times in many cities. He walked with a calm, steady pace. Nothing rushed, nothing frantic. Along his route, street lamps cast long pools of pale light that spilled across the pavement like thin blankets. When Bob paused to text someone, the glow from his phone reflected faintly across his face. He was alone, but not uneasy, focused, and likely feeling that familiar sense of being in a space between moments. Not quite tired enough to sleep, not quite ready for the day to end. Many of us know that feeling, the quiet after a long day, when the world seems to hum rather than speak. But as he continued his walk, there was something else in motion. something unplanned, something uninvited. And though Bob didn't know it yet, his night was about to shift in a way that would leave investigators with far more questions than answers. A city surveillance camera blinks awake. As he walked, cameras across the neighborhood did what cameras always do. They observed silently. Pixel by pixel, they recorded bits of light and movement. Unaware they were capturing the final steps of a major figure in the tech world. Later, these recordings would become pieces of a puzzle. A quiet, confusing set of moments that investigators would slow down, zoom in, and replay repeatedly, trying to understand the story behind them. But in real time, the cameras saw only a man moving through the night with no idea that each step was becoming part of a timeline that would be studied around the world. A sudden shift in the night. Bob's walk, previously calm and steady, began to change. He appeared to pause, to look around, to move with purpose, but also with a kind of urgency that had not been there before. Something had happened, something unseen in the footage, something that made him change direction. He moved toward a building, one he seemed to know, but the doors remained locked. He tried again, still locked. He reached for his phone. Perhaps he was calling for help, perhaps for a friend, perhaps simply trying to understand what had just taken place. Whatever the reason, the peaceful quiet of the evening had dissolved. Yet even in his distress, the city remained calm around him, silent, indifferent, as cities often are in moments of personal crisis. And it is this juxtaposition that makes the story feel so surreal. A man in pain and a city asleep. The final moments on quiet streets. As Bob continued forward, the path of his walk traced a strange pattern, one that investigators later tried to interpret. There were no crowds, no witnesses standing nearby, only the emptiness of streets that seemed too quiet for what was unfolding. At one point, Bob lifted his shirt, and the motion, caught on camera from a distance, hinted at the injuries he had sustained. But even then, he kept moving, searching for someone awake, someone available, someone who could offer help. It is impossible to know what thoughts ran through his mind. Fear, confusion, determination, or simply the primal instinct to keep going, keep moving, keep surviving. Eventually, he reached a well-lit area, a street that was slightly busier, though still largely empty in the early morning hours. And there, as lights flickered overhead and the city's quiet pulse continued, Bob's night reached its final moments. Help was called. People came. The situation became clear. And though the emergency responders did everything they could, the story of Bob Lee's life shifted into something new. A mystery, a tragedy, and a case filled with complexities that would unravel slowly over the weeks to come. A city awakens to questions. By sunrise, the news began to spread. Soft at first, whispers on social media, rumors in the tech world, questions among those who knew him. And as the day grew brighter, those whispers became headlines. People were stunned. How could this happen? Why did it happen? Who was responsible? But answers would not come quickly. The days ahead would be filled with speculation, theories, and surprise developments no one could have predicted. And so, as we end part one of this quiet retelling, I invite you to breathe deeply, softly, letting your shoulders relax, as we prepare to drift into part two, because the story is far from over, and what happened in the days and weeks that followed is just as mysterious, complex, and haunting as the night itself. Part 2 echoes in the tech world as we continue this quiet, gentle journey through the life and final days of Bob Lee. I invite you to rest a little deeper. Feel the softness of the moment settle around you. Let your breath become calm and steady, like a tide, coming quietly to shore. What unfolded after Bob's final steps was more than a news story. It became a ripple, A call through the tech world, through friendships, through families, and through a city that rarely slows down. This part of the story is not about fear or darkness, but about confusion, connection, and the delicate unraveling of truth. Let us walk gently into the morning. After everything changed, a morning heavy with rumors, San Francisco woke up as it always does, with fog rolling across rooftops, the faint sound of traffic humming, and the city stretching itself awake. After a long night, but among the quiet morning routines, something felt different. Phones began buzzing. One message here, another there. Did you hear what happened? Was it really him? Is this true? At first, there was disbelief. Bob Lee? That Bob Lee? The man known for his bright smile, his generous spirit, his incredible mind. It felt unreal. People refreshed their screens again and again, looking for clarification, hoping the story had been exaggerated or misunderstood. But as hours passed, one reality became clear. Bob was gone, and along with the grief came uncertainty. Because the story didn't fit the narrative people expected, Bob wasn't the kind of person caught in dangerous situations. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't careless. He was smart, grounded, focused, and that made the mystery of his final night even more unsettling. A father's devastation, far away from the noise of the city. Bob's father, the man he had moved to Miami to be closer to, received the news in a way no parent is ever prepared for. The world sees a tech founder, a Silicon Valley figure, but a parent sees a child, their child, the child they carried, taught, encouraged, laughed with, and prayed for. The shock pressed into his father like a heavy, unmovable weight. In the days that followed, he would speak about Bob with a quiet ache, proud of who he was, devastated by how quickly life had changed, and bewildered by the unanswered questions that hung in the air. He wanted truth, not theories, not speculation, just truth. But in those early hours, there was none to be found. A city searching for answers. The San Francisco Police Department began carefully piecing together the timeline of Bob's final hours. They followed security footage, phone records, and witness statements, like threads in a tapestry, woven too tightly to pull apart in one motion. The first assumption many made, that Bob had been harmed by a stranger, lingered in the background, like an easy explanation, waiting to be accepted. The idea felt simple, predictable, something the mind could quickly wrap itself around. But investigators approached the case with patience and precision. Nothing could be assumed. Not yet. Not until the pieces began to fit. And at first, they didn't. There were gaps in the timeline, moments that didn't add up, details that contradicted one another. It wasn't just a puzzle. It was a maze. And the deeper investigators looked, the more twists they found. A community reacts in waves. In the tech world, Bob was not just a name on a headline. He was a colleague, a mentor, a collaborator, a friend. His loss sent shockwaves through boardrooms, group chats, and message threads filled with people who admired him. Some expressed sorrow, others anger, many confusion. People shared memories, long nights working on code, brainstorming sessions that turned into laughter, moments where Bob would pause and really see the person in front of him. He was known for kindness, for generosity, for offering help without being asked. The idea that such a man would find himself alone on a quiet San Francisco street, in distress, felt deeply wrong. But as the conversations continued, public perception began to shift, because soon the story would become something far more complex than anyone expected. Investigators discover clues in conversation. In the hours leading up to that night, Bob had been spending time with friends, people he knew, people he trusted. He'd attended a small gathering, a casual meetup among those who shared similar social circles. Investigators began interviewing everyone who had seen him that evening, reconstructing the tone of conversations, the mood in the room, the flow of the night. People described Bob as calm, engaged, in a good mood. Nothing about the evening stood out as dangerous or alarming, but investigators noticed something subtle: the network of relationships in the circle Bob had visited was not as simple as it first appeared. There were connections layered upon connections, friendships intertwined with history, and dynamics that were not immediately obvious. The people present that night were not strangers to one another. Their lives overlapped in ways investigators needed to understand. And so, one question grew louder. Who was Bob with? And why did he leave when he did? A significant name emerges as investigators moved through interviews and digital records. A name began to surface repeatedly. A friend, someone Bob trusted, someone whose home he had visited on the night of the incident. This friend became a focal point, not because investigators believed this person was responsible, but because understanding the evening meant understanding every interaction Bob had. This friend would later become a critical piece of the broader narrative. But at this point in the investigation, his involvement was vague, uncertain, clouded by the same confusion that shrouded the rest of the story. The only certainty was this: Bob had been among people he knew, and the choices that unfolded after he left that gathering were not random. They were part of a chain of events that led him to the quiet streets, recorded on camera. But what was that chain? What caused the shift in his night? Why did he step back out into the fog-draped air instead of heading home? Slowly, details would begin to surface, and the picture would grow sharper. A break in the investigation. A few days after the incident, public pressure swelled. News outlets speculated. Social media surged with theories. People wanted answers. Clear, simple answers. But investigations rarely move at the speed of public expectation. Still, the detectives pressed forward. It was during this stage that they made a discovery that would completely change the direction of the case. Phone records, text messages, location data, digital footprints, quiet pieces of information began forming a trail. And as investigators followed that trail, a surprising truth emerged. Bob's final hours were connected to people he knew personally. This revelation shifted the entire tone of the investigation. It was no longer about a random attack on the street. It was something deeper, more personal, more complicated, and the tech world, already grieving, now washed with curiosity and unease. Because this was not the story they expected to hear. A suspect comes into focus. Investigators eventually identified someone who had crossed paths with Bob in those final hours, someone connected to the friend he visited that night, someone who, according to data and interviews, had interacted with Bob shortly before everything changed. This person did not fit the image of a shadowy figure in a dark alley. He was not a stranger. He was part of the same social circle, and as investigators slowly, patiently, put the pieces together, they began to see a narrative form, one involving personal conflict, misunderstandings, and the fragile intersections of human relationships. This was not a case of simple motive. It was a case woven with emotion, tension, and the unpredictable choices people sometimes make. When trouble brews beneath the surface, a city learns the story is not what it seems. When the first major development was announced publicly, it stunned everyone. The suspect was not a stranger, not a random attacker, but someone connected to people Bob knew. The city, the tech community, and the nation at large paused. This revelation meant the story was no longer One about the dangers of walking alone at night. It was about relationships, about trust, about how disagreements, frustrations, or emotional tensions can escalate in ways no one ever predicts. This complexity gave the case a haunting, human weight. Because where random danger feels far away, emotional conflict feels painfully close, and that closeness made the story all the more difficult to understand. As we pause here, we end part two, at the moment when the case shifts from a quiet mystery to a personal, complicated investigation, surrounded by questions still whispered today. In the next part, we will dive deeper into the relationships, the evidence, the arrest, and the unfolding narrative that shocked even those closest to the people involved. For now, breathe softly. Let your body become even heavier, grounded, settled. Part 3, The Unraveling Threads of Truth. As we continue this gentle journey, I invite you once again to find stillness. Let your breath soften, let your hands relax, and let the calming rhythm carry you peacefully into the deeper layers of this story. Because now, we step into a part of the case where revelations begin to form, not as loud shocks, but as quiet, steady pieces, falling into place one by one. This section is not about judgment, but about understanding how human lives intersect, how misunderstandings evolve, and how a night that began as something ordinary became something no one could imagine. Let us walk gently. Connections become clearer. As investigators examined the details of Bob's final hours, they began noticing patterns. Patterns in text messages, patterns in the movement of people, patterns in relationships surrounding the gathering he had attended earlier that night. Someone present at that gathering, someone connected to Bob through mutual friends, shared a deeper tie to the individual who would eventually be named as the suspect. This web of connections was not immediately obvious. It was subtle, woven quietly, existing under the surface of what seemed like a casual social circle. But investigators, patient and meticulous, followed each thread with the care of someone untangling a delicate necklace. And slowly, the shape of the chain emerged. The role of relationships. Much of what unfolded in the weeks after Bob's passing centered around one idea: relationships, not romantic ones necessarily, but human connections, friendships, family bonds, social dynamics, and the emotional complexities that follow people into their decisions. In the group Bob visited, several individuals were closer to one another than they were to him. Some had histories together, some supportive, some tense, some layered with conversations and misunderstandings that outsiders would never know. Investigators learned that tensions and disagreements can sometimes travel quietly along these lines. Sometimes they simmer beneath polite conversation. Sometimes they linger over past grievances. Sometimes they combust in ways no one anticipates until it is already done. This understanding helped investigators see the case not as random violence, but as an emotional chain reaction that had been unknowingly set in motion long before that night. The timeline sharpens. Piece by piece, investigators reconstructed the hours leading up to the incident. They mapped out where Bob had been, whom he had spoken to, who else was present, what messages were exchanged, what emotions were involved, what movement patterns overlapped, and which interactions seemed to shift the tone of the night. This timeline became a kind of quiet guide, a way to understand how Bob found himself walking through familiar streets at a time he normally would have been headed home. And central to this timeline was the individual who would later be arrested. A person tied not by chance, but by connection. A name the public did not expect. When investigators were finally ready to make an arrest, they did so with careful deliberation. The suspect was not a stranger. not a random passerby, not an unknown thread in the night. He was someone within the same extended social circle, someone whose connection surprised the public but made sense within the quiet patterns detectives had uncovered. What stunned many was how ordinary this person appeared. He had a family. He had a career. He moved through the world without drawing attention to himself. But that is the nature of real, true crime. It often hides in plain sight. Most tragedies are not born from strangers in the dark. They come from human stories, from people, emotions, relationships, and the unpredictable friction between them. This case was a reflection of that truth, the emotional impact on everyone involved. As news of the arrest spread, a wave of disbelief moved through the community. People who knew the suspect struggled to reconcile the charges with the image of the person they had come to trust. People who knew Bob felt a mix of sorrow, shock, and confusion. For some, the arrest offered closure. For others, it opened new wounds, because it meant this was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, not a simple narrative. It was a collision of human lives, decisions, and moments that spiraled into something irreversible. This complexity is why the story lingers, not merely because of the tragedy, but because of the humanity inside it, the imperfect, fragile, emotional layers that exist in all friendships and all conflicts. Court and clarity begin to form. As the suspect entered the legal process, more details surfaced, not graphic details, but contextual ones. These included the nature of the suspect's connection to the people at the gathering, the emotional context around the night, the timeline of events that investigators believed led to the moment Bob left, and the reasoning behind their belief that this suspect played a central role. But even with these emerging details, there remained a softness in how the story unfolded publicly, because court filings, even when factual, still leave room for interpretation. They reveal timelines, but not thoughts. They list actions, but not intentions. And intentions lie at the heart of almost every emotional crime. That is why the case continued to feel complex, uncertain, human, a community still searching for understanding. As time went on, the tech world continued to talk about Bob, his kindness, his brilliance, his humor, his generosity. They shared stories of how he encouraged young engineers, how he supported friends, and how he always seemed to have a glow in his eyes when talking about ideas. People wanted to honor him. They wanted to preserve the memory of who he was separate from the tragedy that took him. And so, memorial events were held. Tributes were shared. His name became a symbol of innovation, kindness, and connection. But beneath all the public conversations, one quiet thought remained. How could this have happened? And why? The truth, as investigators emphasized, was layered. It involved decisions. Small ones, big ones, misunderstood ones, built over time. And sometimes, the smallest shift in emotion can change an entire night. This case remains a reflection of the unpredictability of human relationships, how fragile they are, how quickly they can change, and how deeply they can affect our lives. A pause before the final chapter. As we gently reach the end of part 3, we stand at the threshold of the final section, where we will explore how the community healed, the legal process, the lessons hidden quietly inside the case, and the lasting legacy of Bob Lee. The final part will bring everything together with the same calm, soothing tone, allowing you to rest in the understanding of the full story. For now, take a deep breath. Let the calm return. Let your eyes grow heavy if they wish. Part 4. The aftermath, the lessons, and the legacy. As we step into the final chapter of this quiet, calming retelling, I invite you once more to settle a little deeper. Let tension melt from your shoulders. Let your breathing soften, and allow your mind to drift gently into the soft glow of understanding. This final section is not about fear, nor about the tragedy itself. It is about what comes after, the healing, the reflection, and the meaning that settles quietly once the noise fades. We move now into the last part of Bob Lee's story. It is not an ending of despair, but one of remembrance, quiet truths, and the delicate legacy he left behind. Let us walk through it together. A city tries to heal. San Francisco, a city known for innovation, dreamers, seekers, and creators, felt the weight of Bob's loss in a way that lingered like a fog that refuses to lift. But slowly, in the days and weeks that followed, the city began to breathe again. Cafes reopened their morning doors. Engineers walked into co-working spaces with laptops tucked under their arms. Late-night meetups resumed. Life, as it always does, found its rhythm. But something had shifted. People began checking in on their friends more frequently. They asked questions they had long been too busy to ask. How are you really doing? Are you safe? Do you need anything? In a way, the tragedy awakened a sense of community that had grown quiet under the noise of innovation and ambition. It reminded the tech world that behind every invention is a human being, fragile, precious, and deserving of care. A family finds its voice. Bob's family, still grieving, still processing, still searching for clarity, became the heart of the public conversation. His father spoke softly about the boy Bob once was. Curious, bright, restless with ideas. He spoke about the man Bob became. Loving, successful, dedicated to his children. He spoke about his grief. A grief that echoed gently through the community, reminding everyone that headlines represent real lives. With every interview, every statement, every remembrance, his family helped the world remember that Bob was more than a victim. He was a son, a father, a friend, a creator, a dreamer, and that reminder helped his story remain grounded in humanity. The slow march of justice. The legal process moved forward as legal processes often do. Quietly, methodically, step by step. Hearings were scheduled. Evidence was reviewed. Attorneys prepared arguments. Documents were filed. Nothing about it was fast, and nothing about it was simple. But this slow movement is how justice breathes. Carefully, patiently, examining every detail with the weight that a human life deserves. For the public, it was a time of waiting. For the families involved, it was a time of deep reflection. For investigators, it was a time of precision. As the case progressed, more context emerged, not definitive answers, not clean resolutions, but a clearer understanding of the emotional framework surrounding the night. It became evident that the tragedy was not born from hatred or calculated malice, but from a moment, a brief, painful human moment, that escalated far beyond what anyone involved could have predicted. This realization was not comforting, but it offered a kind of quiet truth, that even the brightest lives can bend under the weight of complex relationships and emotional missteps. The world remembers the innovator, not the incident. As time moved forward, the conversation shifted, away from the tragedy and toward the legacy of the man behind the headlines. Bob Lee had left an imprint that reached far beyond a single night. He had helped millions send money to loved ones, split bills, support artists, and build small businesses through a simple app with a green icon. He had mentored young engineers, encouraged new entrepreneurs, and believed deeply in the power of fresh ideas. People began sharing the inventions he had inspired, the paths he had helped pave, and the quiet acts of kindness he offered without expecting anything in return. In time, the world remembered him not as a headline, but as a visionary, a builder, a helper a spark of light in an industry that thrives on imagination, a legacy rooted in kindness. There was something gentle about the way people spoke of Bob, not just his brilliance, but his warmth. Friends shared stories of him offering advice to complete strangers who needed guidance. Colleagues spoke of how he stayed late to help debug problems that weren't even his responsibility. Family recalled how he lit up when talking about his children and how deeply he loved his role as a father. His legacy, as it settled into the hearts of those who knew him, was not defined by the circumstances of his final night. It was defined by the years of brilliance and kindness that came before, and by the hope that those who walk after him will carry that gentleness into their own work and their own lives. The emotional lessons hidden in the story. Every true crime story, even the quietest ones, holds lessons, not in the dramatic sense, not in the frightening sense, but in the human sense. Bob's story quietly teaches us to value the relationships we carry, to pay attention to the emotional currents surrounding us, to check in on the people whose smiles might hide a weary heart, to recognize that conflict can arise even in places we feel safe, and that we have the power to cool the temperature of an escalating moment simply by choosing compassion. Bob's story also teaches us that life is fragile, beautifully, delicately fragile, and that each night is a gift when we return home safely to those we love. These lessons are not heavy. They do not weigh us down. They simply sit beside us, softly, like a whisper of wisdom, a final quiet reflection. As this calming retelling comes to a close, I invite you to take one deep, slow breath, in and out. Bob Lee's story is a story of humanity, its brilliance, its complexity, its fragility, and its capacity to inspire. Though his final night will always remain a moment of sorrow, his life continues to echo in the people he helped, the ideas he sparked, and the love he shared openly. His legacy is not the tragedy, it is the light he left behind. And as we gently close this chapter, may you feel a sense of calm, a sense of softness, and perhaps even a quiet gratitude for the breath, the life, and the peace you hold in this moment.